Hey y'all, this is Sonia.
And this is Nena, and we are 122 Consulting Group.
We welcome you to the special edition of our podcast, which is called Your Black Best Friend. We're doing this now as a response to a presentation we did with the Centennial Conference a few weeks ago. So we're going to answer some questions, and how about we get into it? So,
Let's
Nena,
get into it. Yep.
starting us off, can you
hmm
tell us what 122 stands for?
Do you know how many times we get this question? And
Enough that we should have it on the website?
yes, I know. We completely fail at marketing, but 122 actually has an interesting and salient meaning for me. And it has kind of a dual meaning. First, 122 is a little bit of an homage to our backgrounds as basketball players. And for those of you who are familiar with basketball, lacrosse, similar sports that have zone defenses, you might be familiar with the 122 press. The 122 press is an interesting press. It's a strategic press, right? It's a press that like leverages athleticism, and it's a very intentional press that you institute based off of personnel and who you have. So I would say that the first meeting leans on that analogy in thinking about our approach to diversity work being strategic, intentional, and leveraging our strengths. So that's the first meeting. And the second meeting is a little bit of a head nod to where I grew up in Colorado. And I grew up in the northeastern suburbs of Denver in a very interesting and dynamic, multi-generational, multicultural, interreligious community in Thornton, Colorado. And I grew up in a neighborhood and went to a high school that was like exceptionally diverse and so interesting and really shaped so much of who I am and what I do and how I approach diversity work. And I happen to have grown up on 122nd Court. So that is the second meeting of 122.
How apropos.
How apropos indeed. So, Sonia, let's get into some of the questions that the Centennial folks had for us. The first one is interesting. And one of the participants asks us, how would you define white fragility?
That's a very interesting question and a great question. I think it's the term white fragility has been more popular recently, I would say, since the writing of Dr. Robin DiAngelo's book entitled White Fragility. In fact, it came out in 2019. So in her book, she was really trying to send a message to white people on why it's so difficult to talk about race in their circles, and then how can they start to approach that. So when she terms white fragility, she's really talking about a state where people have no tolerance for discussions about race or racism simply because of a discomfort or lack of familiarity with the conversation itself. And so when I say when we're talking about white fragility, we're really talking about just a kind of a response. And sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's emotional. It's just a response to not being willing or able or comfortable having conversations around race and racism. So I think, it manifests in guilt. Sometimes it might manifest in fear. And a lot of times, think about what happened at the Capitol just, earlier this month. And a lot of times it comes out in anger, right? So it's this fragility about whatever ego or comfort, like I said, is tied into these conversations.
Yeah, it's an important one, Sonia, because I think the more we can normalize it, the more we can eliminate the fragility around talking about race. Yep.
So then here's another one that came up. What approach should teams take to discuss these important topics? Again, like you just said, let's normalize it, but what are some strategies that teams should take so that these conversations about race and diversity can be had?
I'm going to give you the simplest strategy, and I'll frame it by an analogy. Well, it's not an analogy. It's actually a real world example. We had the opportunity to facilitate these conversations in person before the world was shut down several months ago at the beginning of 2020. And one of the questions we asked this particular campus when facilitating conversations about race is we asked a group of students, administrators, coaches, one question, and we asked them, when was the last time you talked about race? The responses were fascinating. We had a coach who raised their hand and provided an example, and they said they had an incident on their team 2 years ago, and they sat the team down and they had a very explicit conversation about racial dynamics with some practitioners on campus, I believe. That was their example. And then there was a student athlete that raised their hand, and they said the last time they talked about race was 2 minutes ago on Twitter. So 2 years and 2 minutes. That is a vast difference in how frequently we're talking about these issues. So that example leads me to this strategy. Talk about diversity, race, inclusion, difference, social justice every day. Every day. Most coaches, student athletes, captains, they have a rhythm about how they engage their teammates, how they check in, whether that's a check-in text, whether that's we spend 5 minutes at the beginning of practice grounding ourselves to get ready to have a great practice or a great game. Use those opportunities to have these discussions about important issues. Take 5 minutes every day and talk about race. Take 5 minutes every day and talk about diversity values or team values centered on race or diversity. Take 5 minutes every day, take 10 minutes in a department meeting and talk to your department, your coaches about issues of race, inclusion, diversity. Normalize it. To borrow from a sports term, you gotta flex the muscle for it to gain strength, right? We have to build up this competency by practicing these skills every day, make it habitual. And then it doesn't become unfamiliar. And then it doesn't become something that feels so fragile and feels so sensitive. Mm-hmm. I think many of us, particularly older folks, older millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, many of us grew up in an environment where we were taught to not talk about race, politics, anything controversial in a public discourse.
Or that brings on conflict, right?
That brings on conflict, right? Mm-hmm. But what that's created in us is a generation of people who are conflict avoidant and a generation of people who have atrophied this muscle about talking about difficult things. And this is a generation of folks who are now mentoring and coaching a younger generation, younger millennials, Gen Z, who talk about these things every day, every minute, every hour, right? Some of them, not everybody. Many people talk about these things every minute, every hour. Talk about politics every minute, every hour. So if we run away from these topics, if we don't embrace them, if we don't develop the competencies, the ability to talk about things that are difficult, we'll never be able to master that skill. And then when disaster strikes, something happens in the world or on your team or on your campus that is challenging, we don't have the requisite skills to deal. And that's when concepts like white fragility start showing up again. So the overall strategy is simple. Every day, make time every day to talk explicitly with somebody, with teammates, with coaches, with department members about diversity, race, inclusion, LGBTQ issues, interreligious issues, politics, social justice. Make time and make room for these conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question that we get all the time, Sonia. And it's a question about demographic diversity, representative diversity on teams. And the question reads, how can teams address the lack of demographic or representative diversity amongst athletes, on teams, or amongst coaches?
Yeah, that is the question I want to say, because honestly, even though some of the strategies that we work with organizations go deeper and it starts talking about different parts of the operations, because representation is so visible, this seems to be the first one, right? The first thing that people are asking about. And to answer the question, I say there are kind of three ways you can talk about what an organization does. In this case, athletic departments. You can talk about your inputs, you can talk about your operations, and you talk about your outputs. When we're talking about inputs, we're talking about recruitment, right? Who's coming in to the department? How are you getting these individuals into the teams even? So what type of recruiting are you doing, right? Where are you recruiting from? And are you diversifying that by itself? Again, you have to look at if you're always recruiting from the same spot, from the same schools, and as far as even the coaching staff comes from, if you're only recruiting from from other schools that also have a lack of diversity, you're going to get what you recruit, right? But then let's talk about once they come into the department, what are you doing to make it a welcome environment? So if there is a lack of representation already and you're starting to ask diverse individuals to come into a department that's not diverse, what are you doing to make sure that the environment is welcoming to them once they get there? So that starts to talk about some of the operations, that internal stuff, so that, what can you do to encourage diversity if they don't feel comfortable once they come, right? And then, just looking at the culture, right? Ultimately, when you're talking about how do we get people to stay, how do we get people of all backgrounds, of all dimensions of diversity to want to participate in your department, you have to work on your culture. And that doesn't have that, I'm going to say that has to be done before they get there as well as while they're there. That talks about the messages that you're saying, the rhetoric that's being passed by those in leadership, the celebrations and rituals that you're participating in and actually promoting. All those things have a part on if somebody's going to feel like they're welcome in that environment that is your team or your department.
I appreciate that so much, Sonia, because it's what you're talking about is the life cycle of an employee or of a student athlete. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
just about like recruiting people, because we hear that all the time too. I can't get people to come to our institution. That's not true, by the way. But also the sense of belonging that's inherent for folks who come from different places and spaces is part of that recruiting tactic.
Absolutely.
And I echo your sentiment. If you are not able to attract a diverse community of folks, reevaluate your approach. And you know that you might have to shift or change your strategy or approach for different populations. And that's just what it is, right? Different folks need different things. Different communities, different populations need different things. And that has to be applied to your recruitment strategy, to your staffing strategy. You can't just say, this is a great place to be. People should want to go here. And I want you here. That might not be enough, right? That might not be enough. And I appreciate you raising that point.
Right. So let's see what else is on our list here. Looks like Nana folks are asking, what is the best approach to learning from individuals with marginalized identities? And how can white people be mindful of the burden being placed on those underrepresented folks so that they're willing to share their hardships?
Yeah, that's an interesting and difficult one. And I can only assume this perspective particularly comes from folks who exist on predominantly white campuses and predominantly white communities, right? So how do we learn from others without people feeling like that's their obligation to teach? And I think a lot of what we saw in the summer of 2020 were minority communities, but particularly Black folks, really racial minorities, but particularly Black folks, saying, we're sick of teaching. We're sick of teaching you. We've been teaching you, right? So there has to be some level of self-awareness, right? I'm of the frame of mind that you always want to give people the autonomy of choice,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you always want to ask and allow people the autonomy to say yes or no. This is something I'm willing to do. This is something I'm not willing to do. But you have to approach it in such a way that they know if this is a underrepresented person, a person on the margins, a person who's underrepresented in your space or place, that they know that you understand what you're asking of them is extraordinary and what you're asking of them may feel like a burden. So I think that abject acknowledgement is critical to the ask, right? It's not just asking of your labor, it's an acknowledgement that this is labor.
Mm-hmm.
So that's me saying to you, Sonia, look, we have a lot of learning, self-development, and growth to do as a department. And I know that this is a big ask of you, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say yes or no, and I want you to feel completely comfortable saying no. But I think part of what would help our learning and growth is really being able to hear a different perspective, and you offer that perspective as a Black person in our department, or as a woman in our department, or as a member of the LGBTQ community, an out person in our department. You offer that perspective. But I do want you to be comfortable saying no to me, because I understand that this is work that we need to do. And I know that there are resources that I could access to do some of that learning on my own. So I think the framing of that question is important. And then the last thing I said is also critically important. There are resources.
Right. Yes.
There are resources.
Self education is key, and it's very helpful in these.
Correct.
It shows the authenticity, sorry, and the, the integrity of the individuals asking the question. Because then, if you've
Yeah.
done the work already and you realize that there is some different experience that I'm having as a Black person in the department, on the team, whatever,
Right.
and then you've done that work on your own. Now you're coming to me to help to add to what you have learned. That's different than you coming to me and saying, just teach me, unburden
Right.
yourself, be vulnerable to me,
Right.
and all of that.
Yeah. Yes. Just teach me. And I think there's a level of trust, right? So if every time there's an incident on campus, you're coming to me to teach you, you ain't learning nothing. What am I teaching you?
Right.
What am I teaching you? Right?
Right.
What is the ask? Be specific. What is the need? Be specific, right? But if you find yourself going over and over and over again, burdening BIPOC communities, underrepresented communities, LGBTQ communities with the same ask, there's a common denominator there, and it's not those communities, it's you, right? So you, as somebody who represents a majority population, you as somebody who represents somebody with privilege, or a community with privilege, should really take ownership of that self-development, self-learning, right? And demonstrate that authentically. And if you don't want to learn, don't ask the person, right? If you're not open to learning, if you're not there yet, own that, and don't ask other people, don't burden other people with the ask. I think there's some level of just folks need to own what they are and who they are, because I think some of that frustration from community is like, we have a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk, we share a lot of stories, we do a lot of marketing, which is inherent in athletics, but I'm waiting for the action. And they get so tired of waiting that they show up to your front step with a demand letter, or students can come together and say to teammates, we're sick of it. We're sick of all the talk. We need action. Right. And then you've passed the point of being able to teach somebody anything. You're demanding.
And just to underscore, action in this sense is not just doing something. I see a lot of organizations jumping into activity, saying we're acting, right? We're posting things on our Instagram, we're putting out messages of support to our people, but action is about transformation in this sense. They're wanting to see you do more than just listen. They want to see more than you just responding, but actually putting something so that my experience will be different from now on. So I don't have to keep answering questions about what's going wrong, about what's happening in my world. There needs to be a change, and that's what folks are looking for.
Yeah, Sonia, that aligns with one of these very, very interesting questions on our list that says, how can predominantly white institutions, departments, and teams demonstrate that commitment to action when it comes to diversity? What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, just like what I was saying before, it means that you're going to change something. So you're going to have to do some analysis of what's going on in the department, what behaviors are being enabled by systems that the department is supporting. Even in putting this in a team sense too, are there behaviors amongst teammates that is going against our code, or going against what we believe we should be about, and yet we're allowing to happen? We're allowing to happen for some privileged individuals, or some people are getting more punishments than others, some are getting more benefits than others. Those are the things we have to really take an analysis to and find out what's going on, so that you can change those policies, change those standards, and ultimately change those behaviors, because we're trying to create a community where we're all valued, where we're all feeling that we are participants, and that that our experience matters. And to do that, we've got to support it with policies, procedures, standards, and accountability.
I think that's great. And I like your last point there too. We all want to feel affirmed, and we all want to feel like we're part of this community. And I think that has to be part of that measure. We had a question that talked about, how do you know when people are thriving? And I always find that question interesting. You and I had an experience just this week where we were talking about student athlete experiences, and we asked an athletic director, what is the temperature of your student athletes? And the athletic director relayed back to us, well, we had a conversation about this as a department, and a lot of my coaches are unsure, right? And we said, why don't you ask your students how they're feeling? Just ask.
Yeah, it's a novel strategy that we're going to give away for free. Ask the question, ask. Create the situation where people can talk to you and answer those questions, but you have to ask. I mean, why are we sitting in the dark and why are we guessing at things when you have the people
Right.
right in front of you? You have access to them. Ask them.
Yeah. And I think you take that further with, particularly with BIPOC students and staff on your campus, with other folks who are marginalized, underrepresented in your campus. Ask, right? How are Black students doing on your campus? Ask. How are our Latinx students doing, coping with the things going on in the world? Ask, right? You don't have to guess. And if you don't feel comfortable asking, do the work to develop. Again, we talked about
Mm-hmm.
flexing that muscle, developing that competency, practicing if you need to, right? And become comfortable asking people about their experience, asking people if they're okay, asking people what they need, and being willing to bridge the gap and provide them what they need. Because folks can tell if you're asking inauthentically.
Right.
You're asking me, but you don't really care. You're asking me, but you're not going to do anything about it, right? So if you're going to ask me what I need, I'm expecting you to apply some sort of strategy to help me meet that need.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. And I think this kind of ties back to the previous questions too, where we were talking about trust, and especially when someone's asking, you know, how do we approach somebody without burdening them? And this could be true in this situation too. How do we ask our students without burdening them or asking them in ways that don't show that we are being genuine, right? So you have to build that trust. And as Nana was saying, part of that is the repetition, the transparency in what's going to happen with those answers and those responses, and the really you using your privilege and power to make sure that those responses, that those stories and those experiences are not lost, that we're not just listening to them or having them speak once, but that this is actually going to move toward change. And once they see that, they'll be more engaged and more likely to want to share with you what's going on. All right, so
Agreed.
no, here's another one. This is a good one too. How about you speak to a time when you've successfully implemented change at an institution and the process that you engage to go about getting that change?
Give away all the secrets, huh?
How about the framework?
Actually, the framework, right? We say this all the time, that these things aren't trade secrets. And we mean that, because all the things that we've talked about are surprisingly simple and easy, and just take the time.
And willingness.
Creating the time.
Yep.
Absolutely. Willingness is like the key ingredient, right? I'm thinking about an organization. I'm trying to be very ambiguous about how I describe it. An organization we worked with that had just this, like, lots of ambition to do concrete racial equity work. But as we showed up and started having conversations with key stakeholders, key players, key folks, it was clear that the ambition did not match the culture and the climate of the organization, right? And you said this earlier, you know, having this aspiration for action cannot just be transactional. Like, it cannot just be transactional. It cannot be, we're going to do all of these things, when you have to clean up your own house first. So we spent a lot of time with the organization in terms of process, doing a lot of healing, right? So we went into space, we asked people how they were doing, we talked to them about conflict, right? We had them showcase their issues, their concerns, their difficulties. And then we said, in order for us to do all of these ambitious things that you all have your eye on, we have to start to heal. We have to start to see each other as human. Right? There were people who were like, I don't talk to that person. What? How are you all going to expect to band together and usher in a plan for racial equity if you refuse to talk to somebody? Right? We have to deal with those issues. So I think part of our process always deals in reconciliation. Reconciliation is an enabling exercise, an enabling process to allow us to access change, organizational change, team change, departmental change, right? You have to heal old wounds. You have to reconcile grievances in order to support an organization being able to move forward. All of those things that we've discussed today, that authenticity, that trust, that are you going to do what you say you're going to do? Those things, a term that we learned about earlier this year, the term Ling Chi,
Yeah.
right? The way microaggressions show up, the small cuts, death by 1,000 paper cuts, Ling Chi, death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Those small things, like the small ways that you don't follow through, the small ways that we don't talk about issues of race or diversity, the small ways that we don't have representation in our department, the small ways in which I feel like I've asked for help and I haven't gotten what I needed, the small ways in which I feel like I'm subject to having to, talk about my trauma all the time. All of those things add up to a person who is going to be aggrieved, a person who is going to be disappointed, and a person who's going to have very low expectations. And then you cannot now say, after this person has gone through all of this, or this community has gone through all of these things, okay, now we're ready to do change. Are you all ready? Let's go. Let's change. What? After all the things I've gone through, right? So we spent a lot of time with that organization helping close the gap, heal old wounds, talk about the missteps, talk about where they'd fallen short in order to enable us to do the exciting work. And I'm happy to say now the organization's in a position where we're doing the exciting work because we spent a lot of time. I mean, it was months. We spent a lot of time and a lot of hours healing. Right. And I think that that's important work.
It is. You have to set the foundation for this work to be effective and for it to last a long time. And if you don't do that work, it'll be very superficial. Your strategies and responses will be very superficial. The solutions will not last. And ultimately, you'll be back trying to figure out what went wrong and how do we start over again.
Right. And you'll have a lot of angry people who are suddenly not interested in change.
Right.
They're just interested in revenge.
Yeah. And unfortunately, those folks will turn against change. They will drag their feet. They'll start to throw tacks at your wheels so that there is no progress. And that's not what you want to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And justifiably so, because folks are aggrieved and
They're
folks
angry.
are disappointed. They're angry, right? And that's the manifestation of anger.
Yeah.
I think that this is a interesting segue into the next question, Sonia, which is how can you facilitate change that is fast enough for students and others to feel like things are happening, particularly in the life cycle of their career, which might be 4 years, 4, 5, 6 years, but is slow enough. This is the question. The word was slow, but is slow enough that it is complete and sustainable.
That is a complicated question because this work is complicated. And often when students are asking for change, and even when they're coming with their demand letters, some of these things cannot be done and cannot be transformed within the time that they're going to be a student. Sometimes, they're seniors and they want to see this change happen. And of course, they're going to be gone within a year, less than a year most times. And how can they be participants in that transformation? How can they see the outcome of it? So I always say that there's a couple ways to think about this, right? You have to do this work in phases, and you have to do this work in layers. So when you have phases, you can start having some of the small and quick wins that will show some quick changes, some of the things that you can do quickly. But ultimately, you're going to have to do some of that long-term planning. And when you start to show them what that looks like, you have to be transparent about it. Let them know what's happening. Let them know what the process looks like. Then they'll start to see where they can fit in. They'll start to see where some of those wins are happening and where that change is taking place and how they can be a part of it. But if you do things in a void, in a vacuum, without them seeing what's going on, they're going to get even more angry because they can't see slow change, right? So you're going to have to keep them part of it. Now, at the same time, something that Nina always says when we're working with folks is, in the absence or in the perceived absence of leadership, students will fill the gap, right? So they have expectations of leaders to do things a certain way, of course, but they also have expectations that leaders are going to tell them what's going on and help them, be motivated in what's happening around them. If they're not hearing things, if they're not seeing things, more importantly, if nobody is talking to them and including them, they're going to start doing it on their own. And they're going to start coming at you with the demand letters. They're going to start going on to social media. And because that's the way they can see change happening, that's when they start seeing a response. They'll start employing strategies like that that's going to get a response and make them know that something's actually taking place. So again, I'm gonna always side on the part of knowing what the quick wins are, being transparent, and articulating to students clearly where they can participate and where they can see themselves. And then also, again, we talked about earlier, talking to them, especially when they become alums, right? Bring them, keep them involved so that they know that their time spent on the campus was not in vain, that the changes that they were requesting are going to impact the future generations that come behind them.
Right. Right. I think that's so critical, Sonia. And the last thing I'll add is don't start all these diversity clubs, y'all. That's what I call them, diversity clubs, all these committees.
Yes,
Diversity
please.
clubs when you come into the club, the after school club, and you just talk about the thing and then you leave. That's not the approach that Sonia is articulating. That's not the approach that you're articulating. I think it's an approach that's a planned approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to convene a committee and students are going to serve on this committee, they don't want to just be a part of lip service, and they don't want to be a part of endless discussions. Higher ed is an interesting animal because higher ed works slow, right? Higher ed is very methodical, lots of dialogue, lots of conversations about the conversations and meetings about the meetings and emails about the emails,
And the
right?
planning to plan.
Planning to plan and planning to project plan, right? But being able to more directly map action, right? What can we accomplish short term?
Mm-hmm.
As you said, the easy wins. What can we accomplish in the next 3 months? What can we accomplish in the next semester? And what can we accomplish in the next year? Like being able to really map that time horizon to say, and here are all the opportunities for engagement. Here are all the opportunities for student voice to be center.
Right.
Right. And those actions, again, can't be things like we're going to post to social media. That's not enough, right? That's not enough to really facilitate change. So think about what accountability looks like, what support looks like, mapping that on a timeline, and then
Mm-hmm.
inviting a lot of folks to participate in that process in the different phases as you've talked about, right? And then doing that in a way that honors transparency, authenticity, and invites everybody into the power structure.
Right.
And what I mean by that is allowing other people the opportunities where it makes sense for them to be decision makers, for them to be endorsers, for them to be consulted, right? For them to be approvers, for them to be managers of the process. Like, think about all the strategic ways where you can invite different types of voices into a process. And it's not just sports are interesting because everything operates on a hierarchy, but all
No, it's a
people
level
observe.
playing field, right?
You're
Okay.
right,
That was
right,
sarcasm.
level,
No, it's
right.
not. Go ahead.
I hear you, right? Everything operates in this hierarchy, even when we try to democratize the hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so folks are always looking to jockey for access to that power structure. That's why oftentimes when people are looking to change, they look at the coach, head coach, they look at the athletic director, they look at the VP or dean of students, they look at the institutional president, they look at the board, right? Because higher ed works in this hierarchical manner. And these are the people that have access to the power structure. So think intentionally about how you can create more avenues to access that power authentically, right? Does the athletic director always have to be the decision maker when it comes to planning for diversity? Where can we empower students to make decisions about their own lives and their own experiences and their own value systems? Where can we empower coaches to make their own decisions about their own value systems, right? Where can we come together as a community and build consensus, right? And really work together and work out kind of our different perspectives on how we tackle an issue and build consensus. And we all come to a decision that now we can all be held accountable to because we all participated in the decision.
Right.
Right. Really reevaluating and being willing to take a different approach, an innovative approach to how we approach instituting organizational team, institutional change.
Right. I want to sidebar just real quickly on the committee, right? Because you started off by talking about not
Oh,
just
these
creating the
diversity
committee.
clubs. Oh my goodness.
So we know that this is usually the first thing that groups will do, and that's because it's a normal thing in higher education that when an issue comes up, we're going to just create a committee and they'll go talk about it. And that's part of the reason why it changes so slow in higher education and in groups that use the bureaucracy model, because they're saying, okay, we're going to create a committee to talk about the thing. And usually that takes forever and we never talk about solutions to the thing. So recommendations from us around committees is, first of all, don't create the committee until you've created what the charge is, right? Don't just pull them together until there is an outcome that they're designed. Let me underscore designed to to attack, to really solve and work on. And that
Right.
design comes through who's involved, right? Who has access to the power and the decisions, as Nana was just outlining. But don't just throw people in a room and hope that it's going to work.
Yeah. And be thoughtful. Like, what is the purpose of the committee? And if it's because it's modeled across the country, that doesn't mean it's the right decision for your institution or for your department. There are a lot of things that we do across the country in higher ed that don't make any sense, but everybody does them, right? So it's the appeal of the black square, right? There's a social media trend, everybody's posting a black square, but then you have a bunch of people who are like, this doesn't make any sense because we have no commitments and we don't act this way and we don't actually believe the things that we said, right? So you can't just do things because you've seen them done. And I think committee fits into that frame. People see it modeled either across their institution or across the country. And I mean, Sonia, you and I have seen some interesting things with committees of like 30, 35 people, committees who were coming in and committees are infighting themselves, right? Committees that have been created and there are people on the committee that like absolutely have no interest in change, right? So there's no design behind these committees. So I really like this approach that you're orienting people to just be more thoughtful about what the charge is, what those outcomes are, right? What the role of the committee is, being clear about that, being clear about what the ask is, what the deliverable is, what the timeline is, how they're making decisions. Like all of those things should be pre-vetted, right? Doesn't mean that the committee doesn't have an opportunity to shift and change. But don't just bring people together just for the sake of bringing people together, and don't just bring people together to come up with ideas, right? Because you'll be doing that for the next 6 months before you actually start to make action.
What I would add too, and in that list of thinking about a committee and what actions you should consider, is that a committee does not have to be a permanent thing. Usually they're not supposed to be permanent things, but they tend to be those because, again, the change happens so slowly. Make the committee individuals made up of individuals who can actually solve this problem or solve this issue, and then disband and then reconfigure a new committee for the next thing. But when we get too complacent and having conversations about the thing, then we never address the thing, right? So yeah, just some other food for thought.
I think that's if you don't hear anything else from what we said today,
right?
Redesign and reimagine your committees, please.
Yes, please. Okay, here's another question for you, and this is an interesting one because, again, dealing with dimensions of diversity that show up in our communities, we don't often talk about this one. So the question says, how do you address social economic disparity in athletics?
Oh my goodness, it's such a critically important question. I want to say this is kind of a precursor into my response. Is that oftentimes what we hear from institutions is, while we don't have racial diversity, we have tons of socioeconomic diversity, right? And in some ways, many folks feel like it's an easier dimension of diversity to address. So while I think socioeconomic diversity is critically important, and there are direct strategies that institutions should be considering to really address disparities that show up in their departments, it should not be in lieu of addressing issues of race, issues of queer identity, issues of disability, right? All of these dimensions of diversity are critically important. So that's just my precursor to this conversation. I think socioeconomic diversity is interesting in athletics, particularly small college athletics like Division III, because there is an inherent model that introduces this disparity systematically when we talk about systems of oppression and systems of disparity. That system exists in what many people term kind of pay for play, right? So in high school and in kind of club sport spaces, right, in order to be able to access the opportunities to travel to attend showcases, to be able to be seen and recruited, right? You need access to kind of that economic machine, right? Because these things cost money. So that inherently introduces this inequity. Layer on top of that the challenges that are facing many types of institutions across higher ed, but especially small college, Division II, Division III, is this notion of institutions who are really, really leveraging and leaning on tuition dollars in like direct ways, particularly in the COVID era, right? So as we recruit and we don't have athletic scholarships to offer, we are recruiting people who are really giving a lot of thought to the way financial aid will impact whether this institution is viable, which means that you're able to attract a lot of full pay families who can afford the cost of tuition, and or if the institution is able to afford to, has a mission to support students who can't pay at all, right? And they're able to take on that. There is a segment of students that's missing, which is like your middle class families, your middle class communities, right? Who are often put into the difficult decision of how much debt do we take on in order to afford this education, right? So now when you look at what you yield in terms of your campus community of students, you have a lot of that disparity inherently built in. Families, students, communities who can afford everything, families, students, communities who can afford nothing, and a small minority of people in the middle, right? And on top of that, they're coming into athletics and probably being asked to pay for gear, being asked to pay for spring break, being asked to pay for training trips, being asked to pay for and take on all these burdens of cost, right? These are things that many coaches know. These are things that many student athletes know. But if you're not talking about these disparities explicitly as a department, to say, how do we create systems and policies that account for these inequities? What are we actually asking students to come out of pocket to do? A lot of institutions will make accommodations by doing fundraising, for example. Okay, we'll do fundraising. Okay, who's being asked to do the fundraising? Are all the poor students, right? Students from lower socioeconomic classes, the families who couldn't afford the cost of tuition, are those the ones that are the burden of fundraising is being put on? Right? Are there students, are you saying to your captains, hey, you all kind of, if you want to start your own gear store, you guys can manage that and y'all can pick whatever gear you want, and then folks can buy the gear through the process you manage, right? If you're handing that process off, is every student athlete able to access gear, able to access the things they need in order to be successful, right? So really paying attention to whether you're perpetuating the inequities that are probably already inherent in the community, and to what extent do NCAA rules and other considerations allow you to correct for some of those inequities? What burdens are being placed on folks, particularly who come from lower socioeconomic classes, who can't afford all of these extras, right? How much room are you allowing students to be able to work if they need to, if necessary, right? I've dealt with and engaged with coaches. You have too, who say, well, I really don't want my student athletes to work, right? Who does that benefit and who does that burden? If that's the explicit ask, right? Are there students for whom work study is an integral part of their like financial aid package? Are there students for whom you can make accommodations for alternative practice opportunities because they need to work during a time where you traditionally might have practice, right?
Or is there consideration into changing practice times for everybody, right? I mean,
correct.
Let's consider all those things when we're making decisions that are for the majority. Who is that majority? Who's being centered in that conversation?
That's the number one message here. Who's being centered, right? Who is being centered? What is the profile of the student who is being centered? Who is, and it might not even be conscious, because oftentimes for teams and coaches, it's like, this is how we've always done it. Right. But if you're not paying attention to how the environment around you and the environment around higher ed is changing, if you're not paying attention to institutional priorities and how they might be shifting, particularly in the COVID era, and how that impacts the experiences of your students, right? And these are retention issues too. So it's important to have these explicit conversations as a department, as a team, to say, hey, I know there was a lot of excitement about this team gear, or I know there's a lot of excitement about this break trip, but we really need to make this evaluation in terms of how do we make this work? How do we make this work in a way that's equitable? How do we make it work in a way that's thoughtful? How do you create an avenue to say, this is the thing that we're doing as a team, but let's make sure we talk about this opportunity in our one-on-one meetings, with the coach weekly. And you can ask students explicitly, not publicly, right? How is this financial burden? Is it something that your family can afford? Is there let's make a plan to make sure that we're supporting you explicitly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think I would say the same consideration needs to be had towards staff and coaches, right? So
absolutely.
In the department itself, I'd say first, let's look, how is that social economic disparity manifesting itself? Is it in dress? Is there a dress code that is unnecessarily burdening somebody that it shouldn't, right? I mean, do we have to have a dress code? What's the purpose of it? That might be one example. But even thinking about coaches and let's say who's full-time, who's part-time, maybe there are reasons that those individuals had to select that type of contract, but how do we make it so that they are not being marginalized as far as having access to decisions, having access to meetings? How are we designing all of our operations so that we're being inclusive, not exclusive, and not putting anybody on point unnecessarily again?
Right. And evaluating, there's nothing wrong with evaluating. Let me look at my department. Are all my part-time staff people of color? Right?
Yeah.
Are all my part-time staff folks that we're paying poverty wages for? Right. I think that there's this
part-time. Are they working multiple jobs? Right.
Correct.
Think about that too.
Just to survive. I think there's a narrative that shows up in athletics that you have to just the struggle narrative, right? I struggled, so therefore you have to struggle. I made $0. Therefore, if you want to be successful, you have to make $0. We need to blow up that narrative and throw it away.
Yes.
Other people should not have to suffer because we suffered, right?
Transformation. Remember, we're trying to change the narrative so it no longer looks like it used to.
Yeah. If we can figure out a way to pay people a living wage, let's figure out a way to pay people a living wage. Don't just say that I suffered, therefore you have to suffer.
Yeah. I have another sidebar based on this conversation, based on this point you just made about the suffer narrative and who gets into athletics and the rites of passage that they must go through. So there's this whole thing where you have to work for free to get into the pipeline, into the whole frame of being considered to be a coach at some point, or a head coach. You have to start as a free intern, then you get to be a graduate assistant, and on and on and on. But until we change that, we are creating, again, those inequities about who gets in. Because who can afford to work for free, right? Who are we saying has the ability to do that? And why are we prioritizing them over anyone else who wants to have access and opportunity in this frame?
Right. And is that really giving you access to the best talent? This is full circle, because what did we talk about earlier in the conversation about the pipeline and representation, right? We hear that every day, Sonia. There aren't enough demographic dimension here. There aren't enough women wanting to do X. There aren't enough POC wanting to do X. There aren't enough Black coaches. There aren't enough Latinx coaches. We can't find any Asian student athletes, right? Do your detective work and try to figure out why, right? I promise you it's not out of a lack of talent and a lack of desire. You and I both know many people, many times over, who would be thrilled to be able to pursue a lot of these different opportunities. But for reasons that we've named, like, can I work for free? Or for reasons that we've named, like the bias that shows up in interview processes. Or if I'm looking at a resume and I see all they've done is a bunch of part-time coaching positions, they're not ready to be a full-time coach. Meanwhile, I had to carry 7 jobs in order to afford to be a coach, and I couldn't access professional development and all these different, associations and membership associations, and the cost inherent in all of those things to network and do all these things. And that's why my resume looks the way it looks. If we're not thinking about those systems that create that pool of folks that we're trying to recruit from, then we're missing the mark and we're not really problem solving with intention. All of that to say, all of these processes require intentional thought and intentional action, not passive thought and passive action. Passive thought and passive action means I really, really want to do something good and altruistic. I really, really care about these things. Perhaps even my rhetoric, the things I say, articulate that value. That is a half-baked strategy, as you would say. It is a half-baked strategy. The desire, the willingness, the want to is not enough.
Right, absolutely.
You know?
It is the anti, it is the repair, it's the justice, it's the action that's going toward the transformation. So yeah, so another key phrase for all of you out there is let's look for transformation, not performance.
All right. Transformation, not performance. And, Sonia, you and I think we'll kind of finish with this term that we often use is the colloquial term when you talk about diversity is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Our add-on to that term is the J of justice. So we say JDI. The J of justice is critical. And oftentimes people will add other things like belonging and other terms, accessibility. But I think the J in justice speaks to what you just talked about. And it's this notion that justice requires a little bit of a course correction.
Absolutely.
If you think about the justice system, right? The justice system is actually framed off like retribution and punishment. But the justice system is broadly about like seeking justice for people who have been wronged. So how do we apply that frame of justice when we think about diversity? Who has been wronged? Who hasn't had access to diversity, equity, inclusion, our community, the sense of belonging, resources, right? And how do we apply a frame of justice to course correct that? All right, Sonia, here's our last question of the day.
Okay.
The question reads, as an athlete, what can we do to inform coaches that the program needs more diversity and more representation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, this is, I think, where we're seeing a lot of student activity happening. The first thing I want to say is to my administrators and coaches, I'm going to lean forward here. It should not only be on the students to let you know what's going on. Okay. That's that. I'm going to start with there. So ultimately, again, to the admins and coaches and those who are supposed to be the leaders of this group of individuals, ask them what they need. Do some analysis so that they don't have to come to you, but that you're already doing some analysis and seeing what's going on around you. But then, make room for their voices. So for the athletes, since this is what the question's about, I have to say that a personal testimony is always very powerful. For people to become empathetic and for them to understand what's happening to others around them, there has to be some conversation. There has to be some share of vulnerability, and that's difficult. I know that's difficult. And so there's going to have to be some leaning on trust and being able to get your voice out there and being able to share your story to those trusted partners that are going to be able to hold your story, hold your truth, and then help you advance that truth, help you find the spaces to bring that into. So there is strength in numbers as well. So definitely gathering with a cohort of like-minded individuals who are, again, wanting to see that change, wanting to see a cultural shift that's going to support your experience. And then coming together to then talk about the strategies to get those stories in front of those, again, trusted individuals and trusted administrators.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's also a matter of just being explicit and asking for what you need. We laugh all the time when we say this, but people don't know what they don't know. And folks aren't mind readers, right? And oftentimes the feedback we hear is from students, especially, is like, how could they not know?
Right. Did you
how
see
could
me
they
bleeding?
not know?
I'm bleeding. I'm sitting here, I'm bleeding. And they don't know I'm bleeding.
Right. You don't know, right? And that's how it feels. It feels as acute as if I'm bleeding and you don't know. But the framework, right? If we kind of think about just adult development and, again, generational differences and all of these things in which people are oriented different. Everybody has different framework and perspective. They have different felt experiences, lived experiences. For the vast majority of folks in the world live in pretty segregated communities by race, especially, right? By class, especially, right? Most of our lives aren't diverse and integrated. In fact, the most diverse community many people have been exposed to in their lifetimes was when they were in college, when they had lived in a residential campus on college.
Right.
So with that frame in mind, it's important to know that, my coach may not know or understand my felt experience. They may not know the challenges inherent in the lack of diversity on our team or in our campus and our community. They may not understand how microaggressions are showing up in my life, the way bias shows up in the classroom for me every day, the challenges I'm burdened with on my residence hall, the dynamics that are showing up in the team that are hard to articulate and name, but I feel viscerally, right? Mm-hmm. Folks don't know what they don't know. So I think there is value in being explicit, in being real, right? Yeah. And you're absolutely right. That requires trust, because I'm going to give you something that's requiring a lot of vulnerability, and I expect something back. So I tell coaches, don't fumble the bag. Please don't fumble, right? If athletes are coming to you, and Sonia, think about the number one thing that we hear from student athletes when we do focus groups and we have one-on-one conversations. They say, I went to my coach.
Right.
I went to my administrator. I went to the VP. I went to the president. I went to the comptroller. I went to the diversity office. I went everywhere. Nobody had an answer for me, or they sent me to somebody else.
Or I followed the instructions. They told me to go here.
Right.
And I did that.
Right. I went and reported it. I went and did this thing. I followed our process. And I don't feel like those things were just. I don't think they did me justice.
Yes, that's true.
So this is why we're in the position we are. So here's a resource we're going to hand folks for free, right? It's about making sure that there's a lot of clarity when you're having conversation. And Sonia, you and I model this off all the time. So if somebody shares something with you, how do we make sure that there is a shared understanding of what we're talking about? And it's not me talking to a brick wall and you not hearing it, or you feeling like we're having a conversation and then later saying, I never heard that, right? Which often seems to be the case when it comes to issues of diversity, right? So the easy tool is, how do you repeat back what you hear? And so, maybe we can finish by you and I just modeling it.
Sure. Right? I just want to underscore one thing too. Yeah. You certainly hear this in active listening, right? This is certainly one of those skills that you learn about. And often this is where students feel dismissed, because they've shared their experience, whatever it is. And instead of reflecting back what a coach may have heard, the coach responds based on their own experience. Oh, that can't be true. Or, people on our team aren't racist. So whatever you heard was, just get over it, that type of thing. And that is not the response we want you to have. That's not the way we want to,
right.
We want to teach the skill. So it's the reflection of what you heard by repeating it back, so that gives the other individual an opportunity to correct you if that is not what they were trying to articulate. It helps them too. It helps them figure out, okay, what I said probably wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be, but let me try again. But it's to engage further so that we have a shared understanding of what this conversation, what this dialogue is about. And then together we can, feel like we're in a good place to move forward.
Right. And I'll even layer onto that by saying, I think oftentimes our social contract, the way we're oriented to have conversations with each other, is the example you gave. We are quick to dismiss what other people share, or we're quick to affirm, right?
or I hear you, right? I hear you.
Yeah, I hear you. Oh, that sounds awful, right? And those words are empty. Those affirmations are empty, because when I say I hear you or I empathize with you, that's demonstrating a level of like, okay, there's allegiance there. They get me. They understand. And then when you don't go on and act on that allegiance or that affirmation, it feels confusing,
So
because
you
you
didn't
affirmed me
hear
when we
me.
had the conversation. So
Right.
like, right. So
You
now
didn't hear
I'm
me.
feeling like you didn't quite hear me. Right. So,
Right.
but that's part of how we're socialized, right? We're socialized to kind of fill that dead air with like, oh yeah, I hear you. I get you, or immediately getting defensive, right? So it's about kind of training our brains to lower the defenses, to remove judgment, right? To listen for understanding.
And to
Am I
decenter
listening for
yourself.
understanding?
Yeah. Do
Right.
that.
All of those practices are absolutely, like you said, about decentering yourself. So it's about prioritizing the other person, right? So, Sonia, tell me what you had for lunch today.
So today I made a sandwich. I had put all the fixings on it. I had the grape tomatoes cut up, and I had put all two different types of cheese, and just made it up. Made a good sandwich for myself.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Sonia. What I heard from you is that I heard the energy in your voice, that you had a really good sandwich today, and I heard that sandwich had vegetables on it, and I heard that sandwich had lots of different layers, and I heard that the sandwich was satisfactory. Did I capture that right? Is that what you had for lunch today?
Yes, I think you did capture that right. And yes, the energy was there because I treated myself. I treated myself. So I was excited about enjoying that sandwich.
Yeah, the treating yourself is something interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. That seems like it might be something that's extraordinary and something you don't do often.
Yes, that's true. And I don't get to indulge every day. And I sometimes taking the time and being able to do that is a novel and something new. So it's good.
Yeah, and see.
See.
And see. Okay, so the small things that we did were her sharing, me affirming by sharing back, and you'll notice that oftentimes when you share, not affirming but sharing back, but you'll notice that when folks share back, it gives the other person the opportunity to respond, and it opens Sonia up to sharing more.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So me saying, "Is this what I heard?" Her saying, "Yeah, and this is why." Right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm understanding that this is a thing. Oh, yeah, that's a thing because of this.
Right.
Right? It gives that person an opportunity to confirm what is being shared back is what they told you, and opens up the door for additional sharing.
And just another little I guess freebie here is when you have a conversation like that, what you're also getting to is a need, right? There was a need that was expressed in that conversation, as generic and as brief as it was.
Mm-hmm.
What you heard me talking about is a need to treat myself, right? A need to have some opportunity to be rewarded for whatever it is, but an affirmation, right? So again, you can start to
Yeah.
pick out things like that, and that will help you in the future in that relationship to understand what this person values and how you can help them meet some of those needs that they've been expressing.
More importantly, the ways that sometimes they might be detrimentally impacted, the harms that they experience in life, that Sonia doesn't have an opportunity to treat herself, that there are probably stressors or triggers that are making that something so much that it has to be a treat, right? So this is informing me so much about her in that 30-second exchange that now I can layer on to, okay, now how do we make sure Sonia has what she needs? She has an opportunity to care for herself and treat herself. She has an opportunity to really access things that are enjoyable for her. Those are actionable strategies that I can design. Those are actionable things that I can say, okay, this is what we're doing for our community. And I know Sonia will get a lot out of this experience because it's not something she often does.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully those questions and those responses have really given you some insight into the ways that you can carry on and really diversify your departments through inclusion, through equity, ultimately through justice. So it's been a pleasure. I'm Sonia again.
Yes. And I'm Nena, and thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.